You're listening to Power Athlete Radio, a podcast dedicated to empowering your performance every damn day. Join former NFL pro and Power Athlete founder John Welborn as he dissects the greatest minds in strength, conditioning, and more. So whether your goal is to be the hammer, destroy mediocrity, or simply move the dirt, you've come to the right place. Now with the warm-up done, let the gains begin.
Hey, Power Athlete Nation. I want you to go dust off your lab coat because we have Dr. Tim Suchomel on the podcast today. He's Associate Professor of Exercise Science at Carroll University. We're going to get into the squat. We're going to get into talking a little bit about COVID and, more importantly, how to increase your performance from the physiology of strength and conditioning. The guy's a professor, and we have a banger of a podcast. So buckle up. Make sure you got your lab coat nice and tight, and get ready for Dr. Timothy Suchomel.
Tim, welcome back. For those that have not caught episode 407, give us a brief intro, and we'll rock and roll in all your research.
Oh, yeah. I appreciate you having me back. Looking forward to the conversation. Yeah, currently a associate professor at Carroll University in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Probably one of the most frequently mispronounced names in the state of Wisconsin. Yeah, I've been here now. I believe this is my 7th year. I got here in 2017, I believe. Yeah, I'm the director of our graduate program in sport physiology and performance coaching, as well as the director of our Sport Performance Institute, where we head up all our athlete monitoring here. Got my PhD at East Tennessee State under Dr. Mike Stone. And really all of our research is focused on strength and power development. And we've looked at anything from potentiation complexes. I know last time we talked about weightlifting movements and derivatives, but now we're doing a lot of work on accentuated eccentric loading. So any and all things that we can help to improve athlete performance is the name of the game.
Nice.
Yes. And eccentrics in the world of sports performance and then training, to our audience, we introduce that through the practice of Chaldeets and then different training blocks that we deliver to our audience, especially within the Field Strong strength and conditioning program we provide. So speak to just general for those of the exercise enthusiasts, but not necessarily on the coaching level. Explain the difference of the muscle contractions and why you chose to focus on that eccentric portion for your research.
Yeah, sure. So simply broken down, each individual movement that we think about in sports is based on a stretch shortening cycle action, which has eccentric, isometric, and concentric actions. Concentric actions are a shortening of the muscle. We're able to produce high forces at lower velocities and lower forces at higher velocities. It's just the way our body system really works. Isometric actions, we can produce a lot of force, and in fact, more than the concentric side of things, but the muscle isn't changing a length. So we can ramp up a ton of force, and sometimes it ends up taking a long period of time. So if you think about sport in general, a lot of the actions are finished within, less than half a second. So we don't necessarily have the most amount of time to generate maximal force production. However, isometrics are still going to be important. On the other side of things, we have the eccentric actions, which are going to be forced lengthening. They're still active actions where we're still producing voluntary force, but we are resisting a lengthening action. So a lot of different physiological mechanisms are going on at that time, but the long and short of it is we can produce the greatest amount of force eccentrically, and we can also, it kind of flips the force velocity curve the opposite way, where we can produce higher forces at higher velocities eccentrically compared to concentrically.
Yes, and why is this important to understand? Because most programs out there, it's just going to be concentric, like pump, lift, curl, and feel good. We're going to get stronger that way. So why is eccentric so important?
I think, as I mentioned, it comes down to our ability to stop ourselves. I think sports are often, especially speed-based sports in the field, are based on separation and the ability to change direction well. The other thing is when we're combining eccentric and concentric actions, the eccentric can actually lay the foundation for what we're able to do concentrically. So And a simple example is when we monitor counter movement jumps. Counter movement jumps have an eccentric followed by a concentric action. But if we're able to hold on to higher forces eccentrically, then or during a braking phase, we're able to use those forces more effectively to jump higher or produce more force, more power output, etc. So from an injury standpoint, a lot of the injuries come during braking phases. So when we're slowing down, we see it all the time in things like soccer. People plant their foot, but they're not able to stop themselves due to the momentum that they've created. So there's a big push right now within the sports world to kind of figure out what eccentrics can do for us, but also how we can use that to design training methods to benefit our athletes as well.
Yeah, what do you feel the first introduction to eccentric was in our world of sport and then science? Was it the Nordic hamstring curl?
I think that was, it's certainly an isolating exercise. So a lot of people will think of, those Nordic curls as one of the primaries, but I honestly think the first kind of mention of these things that kind of got people thinking, we kind of forget about it a little bit, is some of Verkhoshansky's work when it comes to shock plyometrics. So this idea of when you're dropping off a box, doing drop jumps or depth jumps, et cetera, there's really high eccentric forces that happen within a very short period of time, especially if you cue the individual to basically function as a bouncy ball where you don't want to spend really any time on the ground. So I think what some people forget is that plyometrics can actually serve as an effective braking or eccentric stimulus, but we don't generally use it to train that way. We use it to almost benefit the propulsive or the concentric side of things. So in my opinion, I think Verkhoshansky certainly put a light to that, but in terms of training the actual eccentric phase with more of a strength type exercise, I would probably agree with you that Nordics certainly put a focus on that.
I mean, you could probably even go back even farther and look in terms of bodybuilding. I mean, the bodybuilders figured it out pretty quick. Oh, yeah. Slow, controlled eccentrics, especially once you go past. And I would have to say like Mike Metzger, where, these guys would work to failure and then all of a sudden work on just like controlling the eccentrics. And then the guy would help with the concentric, control it, bring it back down. And then, you see that really evolve into Dorian Yates and kind of his training. And he was big on that, like force reps, controlled eccentrics, post failure.
Shadow sets.
Well, the problem with those is that you need really competent training partners or a whole bunch of equipment that you're not going to kill yourself on.
The same with Dietz's version of eccentric training. You need some competent spotters. Yeah. Well,
I mean, especially if you're going to do it at the rate at which you need. And I think that there's a percentage of max strength that ends up like becoming like you can't. I mean, I guess you could do slow eccentrics with 70 or 80%, but where we really see the effect is when you start going 100 plus.
Yeah, and that's a couple of things that we're looking at right now is the common thing that I've said previously is that we know eccentrics work, but we don't do a very good job of implementing them, especially with kind of those core exercises, your bench, your squat, et cetera. But to your point, I think there's a time and a place to do more tempo-based training where you're slowing the eccentric down and kind of building work capacity. It also increases things like time under tension. So from a bodybuilding or hypertrophy standpoint, it can certainly benefit us that way. But again, as you mentioned, it's difficult to be able to use really heavy loads during those long drawn out tempo squats or bench or what have you, primarily because gravity is still gravity, and we can only slow that down or slow down a load so much. Competent spotters when it comes to if you're doing especially super maximal tempo lifts is really challenging because then you actually have the spotters are actually getting a workout at that point because they actually are trying to lift it all the way up because you're essentially performing repeat negatives at that point.
Can you talk about what happens to the muscle in the eccentric phase? I mean, we always hear within physiology, the eccentric load is 3 times as damaging as the concentric in terms of, tearing the muscle apart. But I think there's some really interesting research, and I was hoping you could talk to that about like changes within the fibers and especially chemical changes in the muscle with those heavy eccentrics.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is overlooked is we talk about it all the time when it comes to stiffness, but the myofilament tighten, it ends up being a really big contributor when it comes to force production eccentrically. So long story short, there's two myofilaments that we primarily think about, actin and myosin. And eccentrically, what we're talking about is they are attaching to each other, but then they are almost being pulled against each other. They're still attaching, reattaching, cross-bridge cycling, as we've talked about previously. But tighten, what it ends up doing is it either unwinds or winds to make sure that the actual structure of the sarcomere itself stays rigid so that we can actually maintain force production. From a stiffness standpoint, I usually define stiffness as the ability of the muscle to transfer force from the muscle to the tendon to the bone. And then what tighten does, again, keeping that thing rigid, it also does attach to actin prior to actually attaching to the Z disc as well. So there is actually a direct link between actin and myosin via tighten. So Walter Herzog's done some really good work on this as well, characterizing different aspects of tighten. And he's essentially called it the third contractile fiber when it comes to different actions within the muscle.
So I was going to say, I mean, positive effects. The one thing that we've seen within our own training, especially working with younger athletes, is there's always this push to develop tendon strength and talk about connective tissues. So especially with young athletes, we're always in this idea of like controlling the eccentrics, smooth accentuation phase, and a violent concentric contraction, which I feel like is how the majority of the world should lift weights. But then, you look at something like Caldites where he was talking about like fast eccentrics and then catching and then holding, especially in the isometrics.
Well, that would be
within the
targeted
isometrics.
isometric.
But I mean,
but then the targeted eccentric is
as slow as possible.
The steady down, overloaded, slow as you can at the maximum amount of weight.
Yeah. But if you look at like especially eccentric based training, I mean, now you're all of a sudden kind of getting into a little bit of a hierarchy of like how advanced is the athlete. I mean, I don't know if I would, and you could probably talk to this much better, Doc, but the idea of like bringing in beginning athletes and having them do controlled eccentrics might not make as much sense, mainly because their technique isn't as good. They really haven't developed the structure. So there is probably like a stepping stone to this.
Yeah, so we wrote a little bit on this. We wrote a couple review articles on implementing eccentric training, and one of the things we talked about was based on an individual's competency, technique, etc. There's going to be a select type of eccentric method that you may use. So the main ones that are out there in the field now are tempo flywheel training, as well as accentuated eccentric loading. Obviously, plyometrics, as I mentioned, can certainly factor into that. So when it comes to developing someone like a novice, I actually do value tempo things. Obviously, from a technique standpoint, it helps them almost positionally stronger as they're performing a movement. It helps them slow it down because, the first time someone gets a bar on their back for a squat, they're just going to free fall into the bottom. Having them slow it down and actually feel where they are in space helps them kind of develop that motor program a little bit better. Obviously, that's not now long-term. Faster eccentrics are obviously going to give us more force production, obviously benefit stretch shortening cycle a little bit more. But at the same time, controlling the eccentric phase is paramount when it comes to essentially learning how to perform these movements. When it comes to things like plyometrics, there's some people out there that they kind of joke about it. Well, you're not squatting double body weight, so you can't do plyometrics. And we know that's not true, but people like to be controversial on social media when they want to be. But you can start off with very basic plyometrics in terms of just stopping yourself. One of the best, I call it a plyometric or not, is teaching someone how to land. Because if they come down and stop themselves, that's eccentric, and it also helps them set up the isometric piece or amortization before they would actually develop the ability to push.
Right on. So then, that speaks to also what Dietz does. He begins with the eccentric.
Yeah.
So that it's essentially patterning through the tempo and slow controlled Then we get the fast eccentric into the targeted isometric. And then once the pattern's down, we have your full range of motion and your accentuation point with the targeted isometric. Then it's concentric, just sets you free.
Yeah, this falls back into some of the stuff we did with Roth years ago, which was accentuated negatives, fatigue neuromuscular pathways, and then forcing the body to find a way to do something dynamic and create new neuromuscular pathways was allegedly great way in terms of developing strength, and we found it actually a huge carryover.
And that did get into the questions I want to lead you down to, Tim. Essentially, like the motor unit recruitment, size principle, and these ideas, like how connected to eccentrics are they? And then I'll explain kind of some of the tools we utilize with our athletes in person.
Yeah, so with our research on accentuated eccentric loading, there's primarily three things. And the first piece of it is that the eccentric load is going to be greater than the concentric load. So as we talked about, you may perform a squat with 100% of your max. So your max going down, but you may only come up with 80% or 70% or something like that. Pairing that eccentric and concentric is going to be another piece, but also mimicking normal movement mechanics and not disrupting normal movement mechanics. So I bring that up primarily because the motor unit recruitment side of things, when you're using heavier loads, you can favorably recruit type 2 motor units and those fibers, which are obviously going to be fast twitch and contribute to more force production, rate of force development, etc. An obvious benefit there is that with normal, traditional training that's generally going to be submax training, you may not necessarily recruit those fibers depending on the load and the intent that you're actually performing it with. But again, at the same exact time, and I know I listened to the episode with Antonio not too long ago, that one of the things that we run into with accentuated eccentrics is that some people perform the eccentric phase too fast. Some people perform it too slow. That's a whole nother conversation, but normal movement mechanics is generally what we preach. And our research seems to be that even if you load 110% on there eccentrically, you can maintain your normal eccentric phase tempo or duration rather. And obviously, if you maintain that with higher forces, you're going to be able to possibly recruit higher end motor units and benefit force production.
Yeah, what are some of the tools that you're utilizing for your study? Is it like those hooks that you have on as soon as they hit the bottom, they release?
What are those weight releasers?
I don't know.
Yeah, so we're doing a couple different things. Two of our projects, one of them is looking at the squat. So we're comparing traditional squats versus squats performed with the same loads but added load with weight releasers. So the J hooks on the outside. So we're looking at 100% on the way down and 110% on the way down, but they're also performing the concentric phase with 40, 50, 60, 70, and 80% of their 1RM. So as you can imagine, when you go down with 110% and come up with 80, it can be quite a bit, from an actual, if you're only doing one set, it's not terrible. But if you were going to do that for multiple sets, it can be pretty, substantial when it comes to the load that you experience. But several different things with it that we're looking at. We have a gym aware on there, so we're looking at barbell velocity. They're performing all of these on force plates, so we can actually see how they're producing force during these things. We have stronger and weaker people, so we're looking at strength differences in men and women. So there's a ton here. The second project is something similar, where we're looking at loading effects, but also multiple sets being performed with AEL jumps. So they're holding dumbbells in their hands. They perform the eccentric phase or unloading phase with dumbbells in their hands. They drop them at the bottom and then they jump afterwards. Mm-hmm. So the whole idea is being able to drop them at the very bottom of the movement. And now, just to be clear, they're not throwing them. They're actually just dropping them at the bottom with no pause. And then they perform the concentric phase or the propulsive phase of the movement. Following that, we actually have them perform a couple rebound jumps afterwards to see if there's kind of a within set potentiation effect as well.
Is there, I mean, you talked about like a target speed on the eccentrics. I mean, is there kind of a gold standard of how quickly or how slow somebody should move on the eccentric load?
Yeah, so there is some research out there, and I don't know that I can give you a solid answer yet because there's been two different findings. As you can imagine, from a specificity standpoint, if you slow things down, if you're looking from a hypertrophy standpoint, more time under tension, you can obviously benefit that way. You may be able to get some strength benefit from it, depending on what the speed is, but your rate of force development might suffer a little bit, obviously, because you're performing it slower. There's research on the opposite side of things that when you perform it fast, you can benefit rate of force development and the carryover. The downside of performing an AEL squat or anything slow is you're not necessarily benefiting the concentric side of things, because think about it this way: if you're going to lower 100% of your max and you're doing that with like a 5-second tempo, and then I tell you to turn around and perform the concentric side as fast as possible, you could be crushed at the bottom. You would probably still be able to do it, but at the same exact time, being able to stand up with another heavy load after that can be kind of miserable. And, you know, you have grad students for a reason. And so I actually had them perform a squat with a 5-second tempo with that combination, 100 on the way down, 80 on the way up, with 5-second tempo versus a regular tempo. And the regular tempo benefits a lot more just because they're able to control the load on the way down, experience those forces, hold on to those forces, and benefit the concentric side of things. So where I think we get things wrong a little bit with AEL is that if you slow down the eccentric phase too much, it may not be AEL anymore. It may be tempo. Because part of what you're trying to do with AEL is benefit the stretch shortening cycle and the concentric side of things. So if it's too slow, I would argue that you're almost performing tempo.
No, I agree. I mean, every time we've had any athletes and we teach compensatory acceleration, one of the keys we work on is they have to speed up the eccentric, which makes a factor accentuation phase, which gives them great rocket propulsion out of the bottom, which allows for, you know, greater concentric. So if they're struggling with it, I always have them speed up the eccentric. I'm like, you're going too fast. We need smoother accentuation phase. And normally the faster they go down, the faster they come up.
I will say there's a caveat to that because especially when you have the hooks on there, if someone just free falls into the bottom, they're not actually experiencing what the hooks are actually supposed to be giving them. So the whole purpose of having external load like that is being able to resist it on the way down and, you know, produce more force. But, you know, we've seen it before where people just free fall and there's like no force on the bottom. And then it's like, oh, I have to turn something on and actually produce a lot of force to get out of here. And some people just get buried. It's the same thing with flywheel that if people push really hard and they free fall into the bottom, they just get crushed at the bottom.
Yeah. For just quickly on the hooks and depth, is it changed per person, or are these hooks set length? So tall guys, you got to force your ass to get there low?
Yeah, no, you can adjust the weight releasers. The only problem is
I have no experience with
it. No, I've messed with them. The hardest part is if you plan to do multiple reps.
Mm-hmm. So the closest thing we came to hooks, John, is just two buddies on the side that pull the plates off, and you got to go.
Yeah, I mean, believe it or not, there was when I was a doctoral student at East Tennessee State, there was a project going on with AEL. This was prior to us getting weight releasers. So this project, I would have hated to be a subject for it because of all the different things. One, you had to perform AEL squats. So you had roughly about, I think they had 115% of your 1RM on the way down. You had to lower two safety bars where we're probably like right at parallel in terms of a squat. So you're still getting a full squat in there. Mm-hmm. They were wearing a mask for VO2, so they were actually getting gas exchange measurement. They had EMG hooked up onto their leg, and So you had to have a spotter on each side that were actually pulling the weights off. So as soon as they got there, they pulled the weights off and then said, go. Mind you, my job to help out with some of these sessions was I was laying under the weights as they're
The
pulling
bottom
them
spotter.
off.
Nice.
Yeah, I was spotting like the EMG cords to make sure that they weren't going to get tangled or whatever. So talk about an experience. I mean, you had to have like 6 people there just to run one testing session. But what I would tell you is your experience with it when you would go down and have to pause there for a second as they pull off the weights. In my opinion, that's not AEL. It's a form of eccentric training, obviously, but it should be instantaneous fall off, the weight changes like that. There are some devices like machines that you can actually, the 1080 Quantum, for example, is a device that adds extra eccentric load, but it's all mechanically based. It records the amount of force that you have, and I believe it can actually give you up to like 150% of your concentric. So it pretty much just crushes you in there. But as you can imagine, it is quite expensive.
I just looked up the price tag.
Yep.
What is
John,
it?
What is it?
Give a guess here.
$300.
No, way over.
$500,000.
$500,000. Well, now it's way under. $25,200. That does not include shipping.
Have you ever done any research where you just purely do concentric? I mean, I'm sorry, purely eccentric, where like for example, you set up a heavy squat and maybe you set up a box and they basically eccentrically load it to the box, sit, and then the spotters pick the weight back up, put it back on, stand them back up with 0, and then just keep eccentrically loading it.
Yeah, I haven't done any negative research like that. I know that some people have actually done eccentric 1RMs that way, where they've actually had to. I know that it was Tanya Spiteri. She was looking at change of direction, variety of things. Part of it was an eccentric 1RM where they had to lower to a tempo to a certain depth. And the idea was that they're just trying to figure out, can someone control X amount of weight? Now, as you can imagine, in that scenario, eccentrically, we're debatably 50% stronger eccentrically than concentrically. So I don't know about you, but I don't really have any aspirations of lowering 150% of my max down to parallel or wherever they did. I think they did 90 degrees. But that would suck.
Pass.
No, it sounds all terrible. But I just wonder from like a muscle standpoint, or maybe from, what is it? I always love when people talk about remodeling tissue. It's like a big thing where they're like, oh, we're remodeling tissue. And I think it's like 10,000 pounds per square inch to remodel tissue. So you're probably not going to do it with foam rollers. But I know that heavy eccentric training remodels tissue. So I always thought that not that I would ever want to try it and I would never test it, but like just a purely eccentric. Just a purely eccentric program. You're like, all right.
Next week, you're going to see him in the gym.
10 reps at 150%, and all we're going to do is just make you eccentrically bend your knees to a box, stand you back up, and then just keep.
It's a good thing I don't have far to go.
Just make sure you send me the video so I have evidence.
I like that's probably one of those studies that somebody did with the military, and then we're like, yeah, we're never going to push that one out. We killed these guys.
That's the Steve Rogers protocol.
I certainly think that there's probably something to it from a tissue remodeling standpoint, because again, when it comes down to the stress that you're placing at the micro level, at the sarcomere level, I think you can experience really, really high forces. But eventually what's going to end up happening, the magnitude of stretch and the magnitude of rate of stretch and the force, your GTOs, Golgi tendon organs, might eventually turn on and say, nope, not doing this anymore. And then they'll just shut off. And that's why people eventually fail. But eccentrically, I don't envy anyone who's had to do an eccentric 1RM. Do I think that eccentric only can benefit tissue? Yeah, 100%, but it has to be within reason.
Well, speaking of within reason, I need to correct myself. So the 1080 motion that I looked up was just a single cable. So like we got dual cables.
How much for the whole machine?
Well, for the other option is a Smith machine style squat rack. That is $49,000 pre-shipping.
So no free shipping, huh? deal breaker. Just rogue
so when the next time I see you in the background with all the hammers and the shovel, there's going to be a 1080 quantum back there.
You know, I mean, there's an interesting piece for this. You know, I've always viewed, you know, like athleticism, especially like the adaptation of athleticism from the weight room on to the field within a few things like, you know, plyometrics, but also that accentuation phase is so important. You know, your ability to be able to, you know, translate in the smooth, you know, transition between eccentric and concentric. I've seen that be a limiting factor for a lot of athletes that have to stop and then begin, whereas a lot of really good athletes have that just really smooth transition where they can go from eccentric and then, you know, right back into a push and then sprint out of it. And like when I look, and especially when we train our athletes or any of the people we work with, I like that becomes kind of the limiting factor, like how smooth that is and how easily they do it and how much force they can develop, you know, coming out of the hole. And so I always worry too much, especially with the eccentrics. And the reason why I like the weight releasers and what you're doing, where now all of a sudden you're hitting the weight releasers and you're forcing the athlete to be as fast as they can in that concentric, just seems to make much more sense than just, I'm going to go to failure and then some dude's just going to help me lower it, pull it back up, kind of like the Mike Metzner bodybuilding style stuff.
I think you know, you made a point before about, and I know that we didn't kind of get into it much, but the ability to use weight releasers for multiple repetitions, it is possible. You know, if you do it in a kind of a cluster format. So John Wagle, who's now an associate AD at Notre Dame,
Power Athlete Radio alum.
Sorry,
What Wagle has been on the Power Athlete Radio.
Yeah. So John's great. His dissertation focused on all accentuated eccentric loading. And one of the things that he looked at were the differences between performing traditional cluster sets, as in no weight releasers, weight releasers where you are performing sets of 5 with only the weight releasers on the first rep, or if you're performing sets of 5 with weight releasers on every rep. So the idea here is you can reload them, but it also depends on the adaptations that you want. So if I'm using AEL 1, where I'm only performing them on the first repetition, John had showed that you can actually benefit reps 2 and 3 from an eccentric rate of force development without reloading the hooks. So the idea is now, and then it returns to baseline on reps 4 and 5 if you were to perform 5. So we generally do things in sets of 3. But anyway, if you're only using them on the first rep, you can benefit certain characteristics for subsequent repetitions. Now, if your focus is primarily on eccentric braking force production, as in high magnitudes of that, then you're going to want multiple repetitions of it. So you perform it in a cluster format. I will tell you, though, that when you reload the hooks every single time, that it's difficult, especially when you're using submaximal loads. I still remember, I don't know when it happened, but I think I posted a video of doing some AEL squats in my own training, and someone commented on it and said, yeah, that's great. I reload the hooks every single time, and I used 130% of my max. And I said, how'd it go? And he said, I saw Jesus. So it's, as you can imagine, incredibly difficult, and not every single athlete can do that.
Sure.
I certainly qualify AEL as an advanced training method. So you need to be technically competent. You need to be able to perform regular squats efficiently, effectively. But you can also use it as a tool, as a novel training stimulus, especially if someone's kind of hitting that ceiling and they're not going anywhere. Being able to benefit eccentric forces going into concentric forces may be something that's going to kind of get them over that hump. So using it as novel training stimulus or an advanced training method is something that we kind of look at.
Is there any form, and this is a question for Tim and John here, is there any way to bring this, instead of just a training stimulus, into a test? So today is NFL draft day. This is the day we're recording it. And if we look back at the combine, I mean, it's pretty explosive, and they're not watching how they're landing their vertical jump. They're not watching how they're landing their broad jump. They're just looking at this statistic. So is there a way for any, coaches, professionals out there to turn this into testing as well versus just a training stimulus?
What do you think, John?
I would be so here's a big issue with like the numbers, and especially within the combine. I think these GMs just want to see a spreadsheet, and I'm more into how the athlete moves from point A to point B. The RG3 effect, where he goes out, he plants his knee, and all of a sudden his knee gets over his toe, and his knee gets a wobble, and he blows his ACL. If he had planted a little bit different, eccentrically loaded it, kept his knee over his instep, put his big toe on the ground, and went back, he would have been fine. So I think a lot happens at the combine where they look at these numbers and they think, oh, you know what, this guy can do it because of this. Whereas I'm more into how he did it. Like I want to see how he lands. I want to see how he moves through space, and especially those transitions. And we were talking about just a few seconds earlier, the one thing that was very, very apparent to be able, and actually somebody asked me this question the other day. They said, when you were playing the NFL and young guys came in, could you tell pretty quick whether or not they could play? And I said 100%. We knew within a few practices whether or not that kid had the ability to do it, or the physical nature and all these intangibles. But one of those things was about reducing force and then being able to reapply force and do it both violently and very smooth. So like a big dude comes into you, and as you're reducing the force, then being able to, push him off and strike your hands and do all these things. I mean, if a guy couldn't do that, or he couldn't get somebody off of him, he didn't play in the NFL. If you can't move through space and redirect, sink your hips and keep your feet in a good position, if you're constantly up high and you can't do it, you're not going to play that game. So one of the hallmarks, like we were saying, is that ability to go from eccentric to concentric, and that ability to sink your hips and move through that accentuation phase is like the difference between those who can play and those who can't. And, unfortunately, the numbers don't tell that.
No.
So
I think I'll kind of echo that a little bit, is that, the NFL Combine, it's flashy, it's sexy. People like to see the outcomes. So we know what the sprint times are. We know what the jump heights are. We know what the broad jump thing is, or the distance is. We know what the times are in terms of different skills that they do. But the problem is we're not looking at a lot of the underpinning mechanisms of kind of how they get there. So shout out to Hawken Dynamics. I know that at the last combine, I know that they set up their force plates and everything there, and we're testing a lot of the athletes with counter movement jumps.
Yep. Wow.
So
Tom Newman's a buddy of ours. He was actually calling me from the combine in real time as they were testing people.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I'm so happy to hear that they're bringing the force plates in.
Actually,
qualitative.
Actually, I talked to Tom Newman this morning, as a matter of fact, in his new job.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, he went to go work for Mass General, so left Hawken Dynamics. Oh, so now he's the head of performance for Mass General in Boston. Pretty cool. Yeah,
they're so one of the things. I mean, this is counter movement jump testing. Something that we can see and test on a regular basis. Something very basic, but it speaks volumes to figure out how someone performs a basic movement. Are they a rapid descender? Are they able to slam on the brakes? Are they able to transition from eccentric to concentric, or braking to propulsion? We generally look at our counter movement jump testing as, okay, jump height's great. I can give that to the coach. They want to see what that is, but I want to know how they achieved the jump height. Did they produce a smaller amount of force over a longer period of time, or did they produce a lot of force over a short period of time? I'm taking athlete B in that instance. I want someone who can create a ton of force within a short period of time. Yep. But that's also from a braking standpoint and a propulsion standpoint. Generally speaking, a counter movement jump is not a fast action. Very rarely in sport are we going to have a max, just the time in space to be able to do a max effort counter movement jump, versus if we're doing it on the run, or if we're doing it, et cetera, all this situational dependent. So when people ask me to define strength isn't, again, the amount of weight you can lift. It's the ability to produce force within a sport specific context. So, a lineman blocking another lineman has a specific context when it comes to producing force. There's a directional component. There's obviously a magnitude component. And when they hit each other, there's obviously a rate component. But at the same time, a sprinter is only on the ground for 90 milliseconds at a time, they have to produce force differently compared to a lineman. So being able to produce more force within a short period of time is going to be beneficial to everybody. So again, from an eccentric standpoint, primarily focusing on that, if we can create, again, more forces eccentrically within a shorter period of time, that's going to benefit, in theory, the concentric side of things, and then, so on and so forth. Now we're better performing.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, like you said, I mean, the combine and these tests are just like, there's a spreadsheet, and the problem is we've gotten so data driven. And what's wild for me with the combine is we have 4 years of college football tape for them to watch. So they know who these athletes are.
So but two to four.
Yeah. So now all of a sudden,
sometimes 6 games for let's just call it number 3 overall pick quarterback.
Then it becomes more and more important. But they have private workouts. They know who these guys are. I just think, like you said, it's just it's a dog and pony show. But I mean, at the end of the day, there's a lot more guys that are starters in the NFL that weren't drafted in the first three rounds than there are guys that are in the first 3 rounds.
That is a very insightful.
And there's a lot of dudes starting on teams that never got to go to the combine.
Mm-hmm.
So, but maybe their numbers didn't look as good. But I think at the end of the day, those numbers are great, but it doesn't tell the story. I think what you're saying with the counter jumps and some other stuff being more, just more important. But yeah, I mean, look, in 1 year we didn't have the combine during that weird time period that we're not going to talk about.
Yeah, the last time we talked to Tim.
Yeah, they got rid of the combine, and the NFL was fine. We pretty much got rid of training camp, and they were fine.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is when we talk, better things happen? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's why we're going to do it every 6 months. So we have to bring it up. If what are some low hanging fruit with the eccentrics? Because I know this is what's going to happen. We're going to put this podcast out, and I'm going to get hit with a ton of questions of hey, how do I incorporate eccentric training?
My 8-year-old twins pulling weights off.
It's but I'm like, you are doing eccentric training. We are doing. I mean, we've always. I'm not a big Paul Quinn time under tension guy. I could never subscribe to slow concentric movements. I always viewed guys that were moving concentrically slow as the dudes that used to get splinters on their ass by sitting on the bench watching me play. So I was always controlled eccentric, smooth accentuation phase, and as violent on the concentric as possible. So if people are trying to what's the low hanging fruit? I'm just trying to preemptively ask some questions so that when people ask me how do I control or how do I put eccentrics in, I really like the one you were talking about with the weights in the hand, the eccentric on the jump and then dropping the weights and exploding. I mean, to me that feels like an easier introduction than all of a sudden asking somebody to get weight releasers and throw 110% on the bar.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of you can classify AEL in a couple different lights. So with counter movement jumps and dropping dumbbells, we kind of term those submaximal AEL. So there's submaximal AEL, maximal AEL, and then supermaximal AEL. So it's a spectrum within itself in that you're able to perform a variety of them. But simply put, the low-hanging fruit of eccentric training is first learning how to stop yourself in different contexts. So again, stepping off a box and landing. Kids do this all the time. Kids are performing plyometrics. They're jumping off furniture and everything and frankly, unless they're landing on their head, it's generally great for their bone development and everything so that they can actually tolerate, those external forces. But the low-hanging fruit, stop yourself on 2 limbs, stop yourself on 1 limb, stop yourself linearly, horizontally. Those are the basics. And then you can start incorporating the ability of pairing eccentric and concentric. So, pogo hops are low-hanging fruit when it comes to the ability to transition quickly from eccentric to concentric. Adding in a barrier for plyometrics. So, we kind of set it up in there's level 1, level 2, level 3 when it comes to, the ability to produce force during plyometrics. But from a resistance training standpoint beyond plyos, starting with things like tempo so that you can control an eccentric phase of a movement with good mechanics will set you up, especially. And now the other thing that people don't think about is the time under tension or through the entire range of motion with a tempo may actually improve range of motion within the movement itself. One of the things that I would do with our volleyball players when they'd come back for return to fitness is we'd actually perform tempo eccentrics, hold it for a couple seconds at the bottom of a squat, and then stand up explosively. Now, people may think about that. Well, how's that benefiting them? It improves range of motion. It improves control of the actual movement. And then you still preach intent on the concentric side. I know I'm not pairing eccentric and concentric at the time. That's not the point of the block. The point of the block is to rebuild some work capacity. So low-hanging fruit is obviously going to be very basics in terms of someone stopping themselves, adding an additional load and stopping themselves, doing things linearly, horizontally, pairing eccentric and concentric, but also incorporating things like tempo. All of those things you can do with very minimal equipment. In addition to that, then you add, so you could add paint buckets in either one of your hands and drop them and perform a counter movement jump with them. So submaximal AEL is something that is also low-hanging fruit because it's not as high as intensity. And what we're seeing in our research is that people who are, for men who can squat double body weight, those who can't squat double body weight can still perform this pretty successfully, especially if you're incorporating some rapid movements afterwards, like rebound jumps. Women can do this as well because we've had women who could squat 1.7 times their body weight and people who are squatting 1.1 times their body weight. Anybody can do this. It's just a matter of how heavy is that external load going to be? Or do you just start with unweighted counter movement jumps and then do repeat jumps afterwards?
You were bringing up pogo jumps. So we do what we call ankle flips, and I think we just named them Maasai jumps, like the Maasai warriors. And we have a whole thread in the comment section on your jumps of these guys trying to tell me why these are not Maasai jumps and that you're not from an African tribe of Maasai.
Well, one look.
Which is the funniest thing. So I get in there and I troll them. I'm like, dude, he's only in Maasai level 1. When you should see when he gets to Maasai level 2, what he'll do, because they were saying that when they jump, they don't do any hands, and you're moving your hands, flicking your hands. So the guys are like, these aren't Maasai jumps. He's moving his hands. I'm like, yeah, he's in level 1. He has to get to level 2 before they stop. This is like the training progression to teach him to be a Maasai. And they're like, he's not tall enough. This isn't in Africa. And I'm like, so what? Now you're basically assuming his geological location.
I'm the Irish warrior tribe.
Dude, like these people were getting so worked up and I couldn't stop laughing at the fact that like they were just, I mean, and it's a demo we filmed just for our athletes. It's not, I mean, like it's just a hilarity of the internet that the fact that these people would feel outraged the fact that you weren't doing them properly. You got to look it up.
No, I've removed myself from YouTube comments. Tim,
I told you the lowest level life form on the planet is YouTube commenters.
We used to teach a seminar on sports performance for CrossFit and travel around, and there was some times that CrossFit would film our seminar.
But they would never film when I was there.
They would only film when I was there.
When Tex was there.
Choose to release on YouTube very interesting like movements. So different forms of skips or floor press, pillar planks. With
zero background or anything like, hey, this is within a training system. And the best one was we used to teach, so CrossFit gyms didn't have benches. So we couldn't teach the bench press. So we started teaching the floor press. Chris goes and teaches the floor press. And of course, they film and put out your version of the floor press, even though they had mine like 100 times. And it was pretty awesome to see the backlash you caught.
Yes. And essentially, there's 2 comments that I recall that have removed me from that. The first one was, when did CrossFit hire Jack Black?
I love Jack Black. I celebrate his whole fucking collection.
The second one was, somebody tell Frodo to shut up. I'm not a tall guy.
So you're
Irish.
You're like the bastard child of Jack Black and Frodo Baggins?
Yes.
That can't jump like a Maasai.
I can jump like it's just not very well.
Oh God, dude, the internet's a crazy place.
The internet is a crazy place. Commentary, Tim, what's it like teaching this YouTube generation? You find that they've they're pretty good learners, or they come up with the most outlandish things that they found on YouTube versus any literature.
Everybody's an expert, right? So
Shocker.
the one thing that COVID kind of did for us was it obviously helped us realize how many resources are out there. Now, again, there's good resources and bad resources, right? So people may see it actually benefits one of my classes, because one of my classes is a current topics and strength and conditioning class. So I actually allow the students to design essentially half of that curriculum and say, what are things that we want to talk about. So in the past, we've done, German volume training. We've done French contrast. We've done potentiation complexes, all these different things that people will see. And then what it allows them to do is actually experience them, because they're like, well, I heard German volume training is really great. And I'm like, okay, we're going to put on 70% of your max and you're going to do 10 sets of 10. And then they get in there and they're like, yeah, this sucks. And I'm like, So
2-minute rest between sets, I hope.
What's that?
Originally when we did it was 2 minutes rest between sets.
Yeah, I think I was generous and gave them up to 3.
Oh. Yeah.
But at the same exact time, I tried to tell them, I was like, I don't think you fully appreciate how difficult this actually is. Yeah. So we'll do things like that. We've done APRE protocols not too long ago to have them understand that you can get stupid strong from doing things like APRE within a short period of time, but because you're training to failure so often, it's not something that you can do long term. So in a way, it's been beneficial to kind of teach this generation of students, because they've seen more things. But obviously the negative side of things is they start to develop unsubstantiated opinions on certain things. They're like, well, I believe this, and I did, this worked in my program. And I'm like, okay, if it worked in your program, tell me why it works. And I'm not trying to be a jerk or anything like that, but I put all my students on the spot. One of their assignments is, I want you to write me 12 weeks of programming. We're going to do a strength, endurance, and hypertrophy block. We're going to do a general strength block. We're going to do a strength power block. Here's your athlete, write it out, but now also write up a narrative and justify everything that you're doing in it.
Social
with resources.
So is there do they make this is kind of an interesting piece, but I feel like a lot of the people within this realm just kind of interchange hypertrophy and strength, where obviously the more muscle you carry, the stronger you are. And it seems to be this like universal piece of like the interchanging of hypertrophy and strength. Is that something you've come across?
Oh yeah. So there's I wasn't on any of the papers that were written, but there were some counterpoint papers. There were some debates at certain conferences. I won't mention names just to kind of keep that, people can go find it themselves. But it comes back to the idea of, how are we actually training? Because some people will blindly follow and say, okay, we just trained high volume, we gained muscle mass, therefore we should be stronger. And I said, well, maybe in untrained people, but not necessarily in trained people, because there's obviously other things going on. I would also make the argument that until you train for strength, you're not actually going to get stronger. When you gain muscle mass, you have the potential to gain additional strength, because here's the scenario. If I asked either of you, are bodybuilders the strongest people on the world or in the world?
No.
Yeah, I mean, by and large, no. But I've met, and here's the caveat, I've met some bodybuilders who were extremely strong because they don't necessarily train for one rep. Like I remember watching Dorian Yates row like 635 pounds for like a set of 10 or 12 on a bent over row. I don't know if there's maybe but a handful of human beings on the planet that have ever done that. So, he wasn't training for maximal strength, but his ability to handle reps is like nothing I've ever seen. So, I've seen bodybuilders handle some tonnages, some poundages. Like Ronnie Coleman, he squatted, like 800 for a set of 10. and never, and with constant tension, never stood up and took a breath, just kept going for it. I mean, they're like Tom Platz didn't do that. Would he squat 500 for 30? I mean, so, like there's an interesting correlation, like what constitutes strong? Are we talking about 1RM? I mean, there's a dude who's like the best bencher in the world right now. I think he did like 1,300 pounds for like a set of 6 or 7 in a shirt, So, I mean, there's some like astronomically strong people. I think you just have to, kind of quantify into like, what's your definition? Like, how do you define strength, or what's your gold mark or your hallmark for it, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, for me, and I actually had a conversation with someone on Twitter yesterday about this, is I am of the impression that you can never be too strong, but this is with the caveat of how I define strength. I define strength, again, as the ability to produce force, that's magnitude and rate, against an external resistance. It can be body weight, someone else, an implement, etc., within a task-specific context. So when you take that into account, obviously, when you're able to squat more weight, you're able to produce more force. We know that. But relative to yourself or to somebody else, it may, context dependent. When you have two linemen that collide against each other, they may not weigh the exact same thing, but they have to produce X amount of force. Otherwise, they're getting run over. So absolute force in that standpoint matters. If you take a gymnast, someone like Simone Biles, who's done freakish things, she's so strong relative to her body weight and able to produce force effectively. I don't know how many skills she's had named after her, but talk about
she's like an ant.
A feather in your cap, right?
Yeah, she's like an ant.
Oh yeah, I mean she's small and strong, but at the exact same time, the ability to apply force is really what matters. It comes down to impulse. So impulse has a general number, but the same impulse, this is kind of what we were talking about before, can be generated from low forces over a longer period of time versus high forces over a short period of time. That can give you the exact same impulse, but again, the person who's able to apply force more quickly or in a shorter period of time is probably going to be the better athlete.
Sure.
Especially when it comes to sports and not having, all the time in the world to generate your force. If that was the case, we'd have like Dragon Ball Z characters sitting there powering up the entire time before they perform one thing. So,
well, I mean, like when you watch powerlifters, for example, especially geared stuff, I mean, it takes them 10 seconds to complete their lift. I mean, then you look at, I was just watching clips of, the European Olympic lifting with Big Lasha. I mean, dude, his ability. I mean, and what's also wild for those guys is there's no eccentric load in Olympic weightlifting. I mean, you think about like the fact that it's sometimes if it's done correctly, there shouldn't be. But yet those guys still do a ton of eccentric pulls and squats and everything. So they're doing it in their training. It's just not that their sport is predicated on it. But I mean, his ability to generate force and go, get to a position and stand up with it violently, like to me, that's a lot more impressive display of strength than watching a guy take 20 seconds to eccentrically load and stand up with it. Like
again, task specific, right? You can produce a ton of force over a long period of time. And when it comes to powerlifting, that's the nature of the sport and the task that needs to be done. Obviously, there's different rules and all of that depending on the federation we're talking about. But when it comes to Olympic weightlifting, I've never seen move like Lash. That is large man. Being able to do that.
What was his body weight? He's got to be 360, 350, 360.
Oh, he's more than that. He's like 400.
Yeah, and he's what, 6'4", 6'5"? I mean, he's tall.
I think he's taller. He might be a little bit taller. I don't know off the top of my head, but I mean, just to put this into perspective, you have a 400-pound man who I believe his best lifts that he's ever done in training was a snatch of 230 kilos.
He's 6'6", 403.
6'6", 403, 230 kilo snatch in training and 270 kilo clean and jerk.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah.
Now, what's
it's a 500
you kind of
kilo
put that
total.
you put that into context though. it's all relative generally to body weight. Now he's in a category that it's a super heavy, so they can be whatever weight they want to. He could be 200 kilos and still probably move for the most part the way that he does. But
400 pounds. Do you guys have any idea how uncomfortable 400 pounds just sounds? I mean, I know you guys have never weighed 300 pounds. You guys, what's the most you've ever weighed?
Well, Jack Street,
218?
218 pounds.
What's the biggest you ever weighed?
You're going to laugh. I probably haven't weighed more than like $160.
Okay. 326 was the biggest I ever was. And when I moved, I felt like people were little planets orbiting me. Like I just felt they were little moons. I was like, I can't even imagine going to bed at 400 pounds. Like that's like sleep apnea. And he moves really well. So, and he's only 29 years old. Oh God.
Yeah. So, I mean, take this into consideration. So he's obviously the one of the biggest categories. Then we go back to someone like Pocket Hercules and Naeem Suleimanoglu.
Yeah.
He only weighed 60 kilos and he clean and jerked 190. I mean, it's like almost 3.25 times his body weight. That's insane.
Yep.
So, but again, if you were to, because the bar has to move so far, you said Lasha's 6'5".
6'6" is what they list him at.
6'6", and Naeem was 4'10". So 4'10".
He doesn't have very
the
far.
bar
to
doesn't
pull.
have to move as far.
Yeah, he's only got to pull it 2 inches. It's like that the guy that has like the biggest body weight to weight ratio on the deadlift was this, I forgot, they called him the Ant. He was like this little black dude, had super long arms, and the guy, I think he pulled 4 times body weight. Let me see, what was it?
I mean, as you know, really long arms when it comes to deadlift, and especially if they sumo, the bar barely moves.
Yep, 600 by a double at a body weight of 132 pounds.
Wow.
Yeah. Richard the Ant Hawthorne, 132 pounds. 600, yeah, for reps. Oh, here's him, 600 for 4 at a body weight of 132.
But again, this comes down to someone's ability to apply force. So, you know, when Naeem's lifting 190 kilos off the ground, even, you know, despite his size, and he had short arms, really short arms.
Well,
so,
he had a touch of I don't necessarily know if he was a midget, but he has kind of midget-like proportions.
Yeah, I mean, if you see a picture of him holding the 190 over his head, the bar looks massive compared to him. Like some people have asked me, is that Photoshopped? And I said, no, it's not. That's just how big he was. But if you take into consideration some people, some of the weights that they're moving, you know, doping aside, because I know he just got popped for EPO not too long ago, was Lu Xiaojin.
Yep.
When he was lifting as a 77, I believe he snatched really close to 180 kilos. We're talking over 100 kilos of above your body weight in terms of being able to do this. And then just recently, there was I think he was an 89 kilo lifter. Can't remember where he was from, just snatched double body weight. Yep. Which is one of the highest body weights to actually achieve a double body weight snatch. I know that there's others, don't get me wrong, when the weight classes were all different and everything, but it's a task. Obviously, when someone gets bigger, their proportions are bigger, you have to move the weight farther, it becomes more difficult. But again, it comes down to how they apply that force.
Yeah, I just don't know if you got a guy that's 6'6", 400 pounds. I mean, he's effectively added so much mass that, you know, now he's cutting it down. I mean, he's a monster. Like I was watching it, I was like, oh my God.
Do you find more and more your students are into strength sports like Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting?
Or just booty blasters and wanting to have like a big butt?
Well, I mean, there's always the mix, right? You know, some people just be those high volume people, but that's generally what they do. But when they come to our program and they want to be strength and conditioning coach, I'll be like, look, use those tools to your advantage, because obviously you've been able to train high volume. You understand from a bodybuilding standpoint what that may be able to do for you, but you still have to be able to put that aside and say, okay, from a sports standpoint, will that benefit them? Where would it benefit them? from a strength standpoint, what do they have to do? From a power standpoint, what do they have to do? I also challenge them. I'll be like, okay, you've done 5 sets of 10 all your life. Have you ever done 10 sets of 3? Because 10 sets of 3 is a completely different game. And a couple of my students actually said that they were going through this right now. And they're just like, the soreness that I experience is a much deeper soreness, but it's not like that metabolic fatigue that they have from set to set. The other, and primarily because you're just able to load it a lot heavier. And, when I prescribe this, we usually start at about 75% of 1 RM. Now, 75% for a set of 3 is really nothing. But when you have to do 9 more sets after that, it becomes a task. So, week 1 is just figure out where you are. You may get up to close to that 80%, but your goal is essentially when you get to peak week, you're trying to push close to 85% when it's on the bar for those last couple sets if you're able to. But what that does from a task-specific standpoint, you're recruiting more of those type 2s compared to the type 1s. When it comes to that squatting motion, you're laying the foundation better for strength because, again, those type 2s are being used. But I would argue that the type of, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about, the type of hypertrophy that you're stimulating is going to be unique. There's 2 different types of hypertrophy. Sarcoplasmic, which is more of kind of the development of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, T-tubules, a lot of the non-contractile aspects, which can still certainly benefit force production, because obviously if, release of calcium and all that stuff. But if we're talking about myofibrillar hypertrophy, now we're talking about, actual benefit of the myofibrils, those benefiting from a force production standpoint, which can obviously benefit strength power kind of down the line.
So with, like when I originally read Super Training and Science and Practice and some of that, they went into there were many mechanisms or a few mechanisms for hypertrophy. One of them obviously being mechanical tension, muscle damage, they went through it, but it seems like the research has kind of narrowed down that mechanical tension seems to be the major driving factor. Muscle soreness has nothing to do with hypertrophy, even though it's a good receipt. Oh, I worked hard, but that doesn't necessarily go into it. And the other one I think was metabolic
alterations.
Yeah, or what was it, like metabolic derangement, where things like blood flow restriction, where now all of a sudden you're asking a bunch of metabolites to pool up. I mean, it's kind of interesting that there was all these kind of different mechanisms, and the research is kind of just pared down into this mechanical tension and failure. Working towards failure, creating tension, and then working towards mechanical failure as well.
Yeah, so hypertrophy is funny because you can achieve similar levels of hypertrophy with low loads and high loads. So Brad Schoenfeld obviously has done a ton of work on the hypertrophy. The problem with some of the research, again, is that it's all based on generally high repetition sets. So the sets of 10 compared to lower sets. So more research needs to be done on kind of those 10 sets of 3 that we were talking about.
Well, is there, not to cut you up, but it drives me fucking crazy where people are like, oh, there's no difference between sets of 25 and sets of 6 if you're going to failure. And I can tell you from having lifted weights for a lot of years, I can tell you a remarkable difference between the people that went heavy for a set of 6 and the people that went light for a set of 25. If you say, and then the fact that, the hypertrophy is the same, it's a different hypertrophy. And there's
the
different
Pepsi challenge of just looking at them?
Well, I used to, 100%. I could tell you, and I wrote about this shit 10 plus years ago, and I've been saying it for 20 years. I could walk into a weight room or walk into an NFL locker room, and I could tell you who'd been lifting heavy weights and who hadn't, regardless of when they went to failure. There was a remarkable difference now within the traps and the structure. I could tell you, I know exactly what your programming looks like based upon your physical structure.
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, when it comes to that hypertrophy, the low intensity sets to failure. I mean, if you're doing 15, 20, 30 repetitions or something like that, sets of failure, yeah, you're going to certainly get that muscle pump and everything, and a different type of hypertrophy. But I would argue that that type of hypertrophy may actually go away go away more rather, because of all the metabolism aspects, the swelling that you end up getting that's temporary. However, when it comes to that myofibular side of things, the higher intensity repetitions that you have, that, like you said, it's a different type of hypertrophy that may actually stick around for a longer period of time. Now, again, I'm not the expert on hypertrophy. I'd refer people to Brad Schoenfeld, Cody Hahn, those type of people. But at the same time, how it benefits in our world, strength and power development, certainly makes a difference. If the goal is to, kind of look good naked, at the same exact time, you can do high intensity, low intensity, it doesn't matter. You're getting your benefits of hypertrophy. But if we're talking about sport performance, it can be a bit more task specific and load specific. So to your point, John, I would certainly fall under the camp of tension being the primary driver of hypertrophy. It doesn't mean that the others aren't involved in terms of metabolic alterations or damage, because obviously if we're talking about high tension and we're using eccentrics, we're going to create some damage. And before the remodeling process actually takes place, we just have to figure out how we're going to use that to our advantage and if it's going to benefit, our strength and power kind of down the line.
I've always felt it was easier to focus on hypertrophy after somebody was already strong. We've dealt with this for a number of years where, hey, I just want to be jacked, I want to put on muscle. And I'm like, it's a lot easier to put on muscle after you're strong. So let's start there. And the muscle comes as a byproduct if you want to switch it up. But I think if you just go day one, just trying to build hypertrophy, I just think that people will lean on these sets of 25 and those don't do anything to drive our primary driver, which is that strength, that neurological efficiency to be able to move weights.
I do. And I know that there was a project within the past few years, I cannot remember off the top of my head, so I apologize, but it did happen to show that there would be a greater benefit to hypertrophy following a general strength block.
Yeah.
So it kind of comes back to that fluctuation of how we're performing our blocks. Instead of doing, the standard sets of 10, sets of 5, sets of 3, and then you start over again, it's kind of a wave motion where you're actually working your way back up before working your way back down. So but also not experiencing necessarily the same thing. If you're doing sets of 10, the first go round of kind of a hypertrophy type block, maybe you only do sets of 8 the next time you come back to it as you move closer and closer to preseason and then the season.
I hate lifting the same reps every week. Like 5 sets of 10, and then you got to do that for the next 10 weeks. That drives me absolutely crazy because, for me, I'm always looking at progressive overload.
You've also been lifting
for a long time. I know, but I also realize that progressive overload is the single greatest point for me getting stronger, and it's either got to be more reps, more weight, or more sets. So you're always constantly tweaking these little things. The people that, and I've seen this for years too, people that are like, oh, I just do 5 sets of 5 at 225, and I haven't increased my strength in 2 years. And I'm like, so wait a minute, you go do the exact same thing every time? That's like my dad that just ran 1 mile every day, and he ran the same deal, never tried to run it faster, and never went longer. And then wonder why he progressively got in worse shape.
Yes, and we need to introduce that we still ask on our Bedrock program a linear progression for our novice athletes that progress through a coordination phase into a hypertrophy phase based off the novice window as posed in super training. But then they establish a base level of strength, and now we can have fun with the different rep schemes. Yep. So we do ask our athletes to hit the linear progression.
I
plus
get it.
Sprints.
But that's their initial. I'm telling you for myself.
I understand you, but then you've established this longevity of weightlifting. But don't think that you can take what John Wellborn does today, listeners, new to this, and accomplish the same thing that John has with bicep veins and 8% body fat and the best looking NFL lineman in Philadelphia.
Oh yeah, but that was a really low, shallow pool. Have you ever walked around Philly? Yeah, I was. I keep telling him I was voted one of Philly's 50 best looking people, and I remember being like, man, I'm not even the best looking person on my block growing up in California. So no shade on Philly, but
we mentioned in season. Now, do eccentrics have a place in-season training for athletes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're obviously not going to be doing a massive emphasis on eccentric training in season, but you should at least be maintaining what you previously had gained. So not to say that it's partially conjugate mentality, but you don't want it to go away. So you also have to take the sport demands that they end up having. So I had the opportunity to work with a lot of our volleyball players here. They perform eccentric loading all the time because they're landing all the time. So actually what I would end up doing for some of our squats, basically we would take the first half of the season, which is non-conference season, and we'd still be loading their squats really heavy, eccentric, concentric. But once the conference season started, we used squats, like full squats, as a warm-up before using partial squats as our primary driver of that, that intent, but also max effort. We would eliminate the eccentric aspect of it because of all the landing and everything that they're already doing. It's not to say that we're going to completely eliminate it, because we're still performing, regular squats as warm-ups, but there's a time and a place that you need to probably back off a little bit to make sure that they stay fresh with it. That being said, if we were able to perform submaximal AEL with these individuals where you're using, dumbbell jumps, you're still benefiting the rapid force production component of it. I would argue this: if you get to the season and you're not strong yet, it's not going to benefit you to do super maximal AEL or maximal AEL. It's definitely not going to benefit you to do tempo things because it's only going to slow you down in terms of force production. So you need to consider the training demands or the goals rather of what you're trying to achieve. In season, it's rapid force production, it's high force production, and it's power output. So these are all the things that you need to do to be explosive and competitive. So we may do submaximal AEL because it's low demand in terms of the actual eccentric side of things, relatively speaking. There's not a lot of time under tension, but from a volleyball standpoint with these athletes, they're already doing, a ton of eccentric loading because they're landing. They're also performing a lot of jumping movements in general. Change of direction things they're doing as well. So consider it from a field sport standpoint or basketball. They have a lot of change of directions in season as well. They have a lot of landing. You also have to consider the sprinting component of it when it comes to a field-based sport. Those are all eccentric actions as well. So I would make the argument that off-season and preseason, you're going to have a much larger emphasis on eccentric training, these types of methods, rather than in season. You may incorporate some, but it's not going to be your super maximal type of squats. Now, again, this is based on the individuals that you have. I know for some individuals, they'll I know Brad DeWeese had talked about how some of his bobsledders in the past have done really, really heavy squats the week of competition. Some of them would actually, PR during that time. But I wouldn't necessarily say, and I don't know this, I don't know that they'd be using accentuated eccentric loading during that time.
Years ago when I spoke to Charlie Francis, he made mention that I think it was Ben Johnson box squatted. I think it was like 610 or 605 for like a triple, like 3 days before he ran the world record. Had a body weight of like 185, 175. So, pretty impressive stuff. We interrupt this episode with a shameless self-promotion. Are you pushing through performance roadblocks caused by pain or janky movement mechanics? Knock the rust off with our movement health courses, used by thousands of athletes worldwide, from average Joes to MVPs. Our courses give you the tools to assess and fix yourself so you can get back to break-in necks and cash in checks. Not convinced? Get a taste of how our courses can help you by enrolling in a free sample today. Head to powerathletehq.com and search courses from the menu. Now back to the show. Early on, you made mention a little bit of Verkhoshansky's kind of hallmark for plyometrics, which was the double body weight back squat. And then at the time felt like, once you had double body weight back squat, you'd obviously had enough time, enough training that they could take you on and do more advanced plyometrics like depth jumps and whatnot. Is there something with the eccentric training where the stronger somebody is and the closer to that double body weight back squat, the more benefits they reap? Whereas maybe somebody who doesn't have that, maybe they got a body weight, 1.2, 1.3, maybe not be able to progress as fast as somebody who is stronger?
Yeah, so we actually will be presenting some work at the NSCA National Conference this summer. I have a couple presentations where we're talking about implementing eccentric training, and also a hands-on one where we're actually going to show live force testing of different types of eccentric training. But in addition to that, my students and myself are going to be presenting some abstracts that kind of detail some of the work that we're doing that's not published yet. Part of it, what we ended up seeing is we were running correlations between people's relative strength, but also the braking impulse that they were actually able to generate during AEL squats. So what we ended up seeing with the men is there was a correlation of something like 0.8. So really, really high correlation. Basically what it ends up telling us, and again, it's not cause and effect, but stronger individuals are able to produce more force or a greater braking impulse when they have these hooks on the way down. So they're able to stop themselves more effectively compared to weaker individuals. We saw a similar correlation with women as well. Now, women, the subject pool that we ended up having, we kind of had the spectrum. So it's difficult to say, here's the stronger women, here are the weaker women. But in a general correlation, we see something very similar. So to your point, this is kind of why you make the justification for an individual to use or not use this method. Does it have to be a double body weight squat? No. But it is within the literature, it seems to be a standard to say, okay, this person, they can squat double, they're in this group. If they don't squat double, they're in this group. But I would also argue that the 2 times body weight has a standard deviation itself. It could be 1.8, it could be 2.2. So sure, depending on who you read, I wouldn't necessarily, I definitely wouldn't say everyone has to squat double body weight. But I would say that they should be as strong as possible within the context of their sport.
Yeah, I always felt that the double body weight was obviously great something to shoot for, but it wasn't necessarily going to stop us from taking somebody to more advanced training. But also somebody who barely squats their body weight, I'm not going to put them into a bunch of heavy dose plyometrics unless they're really small. We had women that, or even smaller athletes that maybe squatted their body weight, but because they weighed 110, 115 pounds, the load wasn't as big. But then you bring in like a bigger guy who's 250 pounds. I mean, he needs more strength to be able to control, just from the fact that it just looked really sloppy, especially in the landing on the eccentric phases.
Well, and prescribing plyometrics with really big individuals is you're kind of towing a fine line there, because they already walk around and have to absorb that force every single time they stride. If you think about, again, if you get a bigger individual, a rugby athlete, a front row player or something like that, these guys and women can move, and they're big individuals. But every single time they put their foot in the ground, that's a lot of force that they have to accept every single time. So being able to do basic plyometrics with bigger individuals can certainly still benefit them, but the volume needs to be controlled to make sure that they're not experiencing excess braking forces beyond what they're already doing.
Tex, what was it we were reading yesterday in that article, them talking about, was it muscle to bone ratio?
Yeah, muscle to bone ratio. So the Washington Post, taking advantage of the NFL draft situation, put out one of the dudes from Exos wrote some expose for the Post about muscle to bone ratio and how the more muscle
in relationship to bone
leads to injury, and is for NFL players.
Yeah. So he was saying that there was like a ratio, I want to say it was like 5 to 1 or 5.1. I don't know how they calculated it. It'd have to be done off a DEXA scan, I would imagine. But they were saying that like the higher muscle to bone ratio, the greater the chance of injury, based upon the fact that there was so much more force on the bones.
Yeah, that's interesting, because again, it has to be specific to what we're talking about, because obviously type 2 fibers, just being thicker and more abundant, are probably going to weigh more than type 1 fibers. So especially when you get athletes that are going to be in an explosive sport such as football, they're going to be more type 2 dominant than they would be type 1 dominant. So again, I'll have to read more on that
I'll forward it to you, but I
the-
kind of got like my Spock eyebrow went up, and it seemed like a little bit of bullshit. And the reason being is there's definitely, I think, a correlation. And you think about Wolff's Law and just the amount of stress put on the skeleton, especially when you get to NFL football. There's so much, like you said, you're striding, you're a big dude, you're putting your foot in the ground, you're hitting individuals. Like the bone thickness is so much greater. And the only reason that this becomes an issue was I broke my leg. And when they x-rayed my leg, the doctor laughed because my bones were completely white. And he's like, God, look how thick your bones are. Like he's like, you can tell, like you can see this isn't normal. This is what a normal x-ray looks like. And you could see kind of like shading and some black spots. My stuff was like completely white. And then when like for the skull, this was another interesting one when I retired. They were talking about the skulls of offensive linemen being dramatically thicker, and especially the fascia in the head being thicker from all of the impacts as almost armor around it. And so I went to have this guy go do some cranial manipulation stuff, and he's like, it's kind of useless based upon some of the offensive linemen that he'd worked with because the skulls were so thick. So, I mean, definitely a case of like, you're ramming your head into a wall, you're lifting weights, you're training, you're doing, high protein diet, all these things. And I think that the bones have to be heavy. If not, you're just going to break. So I thought that was kind of...
Yeah, I know that if you look at I know there's been some research on some powerlifter bone density, and it's crazy. You mentioned Wolff's Law. I mean, I would also argue that it applies to more tissues than just bone as well, because the muscle becomes resilient, the tendons become resilient. So obviously the stress that we place upon them is going to dictate the adaptation that we're going to end up getting. So when it comes to hypertrophy, as we were talking about, if we're placing a higher tension on the muscle, it's going to adapt a certain way. Versus if we never load the muscles, I'm making up a number, 80% or higher, then we're not necessarily going to be able to experience or get those adaptations that we're looking for.
The article's More Muscle, More Problems, Washington Post, how one metric could change NFL training.
Oh God!
Boy.
It's like when I was a kid, we went to London, and we traveled around and like went to all these different castles my parents were into. And I remember there was a really cool exhibit where they were showing skeletons, and they knew whether or not the guys were archers.
Oh,
did you ever see this?
No, but go on.
So in the they showed these skeletons that they had somehow found. I don't know, but the archer's arm was like 3 times more developed than the other side because they had to pull these huge bows, so they could tell when they were archers because they had like one massive arm and then one obviously skinny arm. But they could
sure they were archers.
That's what they said. I mean, they could have been, I don't know, just real lonely guys, but they're I mean, it was pretty significant. And they were like, we knew these guys were archers because look at their arm, like the one-sided development.
Jake is writing that down as a note. The article,
that's going to be our soundbite.
Where we referenced the jump mats for qualitative movement and how that could help guide a draft. The article is suggesting the MBR ratio, it's called, muscle to bone ratio, would help guide the draft process. If a GM is scouting a dozen 6'6" offensive tackles, MBR would tell him who could gain muscle and who is already maxed out, only be able to add fat, which sometimes can help alignment. John, do you agree?
No. I do think I viewed muscle as obviously body armor. And, I knew other guys looked at body fat as body armor. I think it really just came down to a body weight. Some people have, and dude, I really think this goes back to training and just like nutrition and some of the other stuff. I mean, Nick Hardwick and I had a great conversation. He's like, man, I wish I knew today, because everybody says that. He's like, I wouldn't have had to been a 20, 22, 25% body fat guy to be 300 pounds. I could have understood how to train, how to do it, and actually trained for hypertrophy and had a better package to put together, which I think would have created greater longevity. I mean, we know that fat's extremely oxidative, and so when you carry that much excess body fat, recovery becomes an issue, and all the other factors that are, looking for performance, fats or muscles extremely insulin sensitive. But I do know, and here's another caveat to that. The year when I was in Philly, one year they got a bod pod. And we all threw in money to see who could be whoever came in the leanest. And then also we made a Mr. Potato Head and basically a shame award for the fattest guy. So I dieted, and I was 306 at 282 pounds of lean muscle. So I was right around 7-8%. And so I was the only dude at the time that ever tested over 300 under 10%, but I dieted for it. And I do know when I went to training camp, that first week of training camp, I was seriously bruised up. So I had a lot more bruises than normal. And I remember the doc's like, man, you might need to gain some body fat just to maybe reduce the bruising. So I don't know if that was a key factor, but I definitely know I feel better the less fat I have and the more muscle I carry.
So Tim, I'll send you this way because they get into concentric, eccentric here. For an example, the reference the Exos trainer during a 10-week program, Callaway and his team can't reduce a player's MBR. They can only try to stop a player from gaining muscle mass. For the too jacked linebacker, they adapted the program with a three-pronged approach. First, they replaced eccentric exercises such as back squats, which promote muscle growth, with concentric ones such as trap bar deadlifts. Then, they tweaked his meals and supplements to reduce the number of excess calories and added plyometric exercises to help him adjust to the muscle mass he already had. Then, you got to continue reading. They only mentioned 2. Awesome work, Washington Post.
If a pro athlete came to me and they're like, here's the deal.
I'm too jacked.
I don't want to gain an ounce of muscle. I actually need you to make me doughier. I'd be like, I'm not the right guy for you.
I'll take them. Let's go get some donuts.
Yeah. Oh my God.
It comes down to again, functional mass versus non-functional mass. So again, I can see where some people make an argument for linemen to have more fat than someone like a skill player because they ultimately weigh more and it's harder to move. But at the same time, if I can make more of that mass functional mass, now I'm going to run someone over compared to being able to just accept the load that someone's placing on me. So, we talk about Lasha previously. So Lasha is in a super heavy category. That doesn't necessarily mean that, if he's 180 kilos now, if he gains an extra 5 kilos of muscle mass, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to be able to move, increase his total X number of amount. But I know Holly Mangold a while back when she was competing, she made it because she went on to The Biggest Loser for a while. And then she said my ability to Olympic weightlift. So, but it came down to how much mass, in her mind, it came down to what kind of mass that she had. Now, everyone who's seen Biggest Loser, it's a ton of cardio, and I mean they're running those people into the ground quite a bit. So, but at the same time, if you're losing muscle mass, which you generally are going, if you're going to lose a lot of weight, you're going to lose some muscle mass. It's going to negatively impact your ability to produce force in the long term. So again, functional mass versus non-functional mass, just because someone gains more weight doesn't necessarily mean that it's all going to be muscle mass. And in fact, I'd challenge anyone to say that they could only gain muscle mass.
Yeah, no, you're always going to lose it. One of our athletes that we started training with 6 months ago, I think he was 292. And we dieted him down. He's 248 now, and he's dramatically stronger than he was at 290. I mean, it's almost to the point where I'm surprised that a guy could lose 40 pounds and still be that much stronger. I mean, it's I rolled with the Rush yesterday. We kind of shark tanked him a little, and dude, his grip and his strength is out of the world. I mean, dramatically more than what it was when he was 290. So, I mean, it's pretty impressive. I mean, but then at the end of the day, I mean, how much muscle did he lose? How much? I mean, the majority, I can see it. The majority of what he lost was fat, and I just don't think that non-functional tissue is a benefit if it's not going to allow you to produce
non-functional tissue in the sense of the sarcoplasmic fluid hypertrophy versus the.
Well, I don't necessarily think
dense.
fat is functional tissue.
You're right. You are correct. But what I believe Tim was referencing was the sarcoplasmic, and correct me if I'm wrong, hypertrophy.
I mean, it could be both, honestly. I wouldn't be surprised if when people lose dramatic amounts of weight, that they're probably going to a point. Obviously, you're going to lose more fat mass, but given all the stress that you're placed on your body, the hormones that are running around, there's a ton of cortisol that's going to break down some of that protein and whatnot. You're going to have to lose some muscle mass because it's going to have to come from somewhere. That being said, individuals who are able to maintain a relatively healthy weight, I'm talking about weight-based sports. So if we talk about our weightlifters, they're generally going to train either at or slightly above where they would normally compete at, so that when they cut down, they're not going to lose dramatic amounts of muscle mass. Now, if you talk about individuals who say, okay, they're in a weight class that's kind of in the middle of two different weight classes, if they gain up to one class, they're going to gain muscle mass, but they're probably going to gain fat mass. But on the opposite side of things, if they lose weight or cut down, they're probably going to lose some strength. To John's point, depending on how they cut, but also what kind of mass they actually lose.
Yeah, I think we did it over 16 weeks. So it was a nice, slow, easy cut. And, kept his energy high, and he felt great on through the whole thing, but he did all the extra work he needed to. So, no, it's good. I mean, I'm always happy when I can see somebody lean out that much and then also maintain their strength.
Yeah, if only they listened and took their progress pictures. Fucking shame.
I do find that an aspect text of that article you mentioned of calling squats eccentric exercises,
and then a trap bar deadlift is just a concentric movement. Because, who would think that you might have to
ghost that bar?
Fuck.
I mean, the two jacked backer. I want to know who it is.
I can't think I've ever thought, oh, God, that guy's got way too much muscle on him.
Well, I'm sure I can do some Google and search who Exos is really proud of in the NFL and just find out who this is.
Now, admittedly, there's obviously going to be a point if someone you could say that someone's too big, because you're not going to see many bodybuilders go out and compete in football.
No.
Just because when someone has that much muscle mass, there's a classic video of a bunch of bodybuilders running out of a building. They're like sprinting down the street, and then they're flexing in the middle of the street and everything like that. But watching a bodybuilder run is very entertaining to me.
Yeah.
You got to tell them the story.
Of what?
The dude that bench 500 pounds.
Oh, yeah. I think it was closer to so there was I can't remember if it was more than 500, but it wasn't 6. We were in training, or we were in early in the season. It might have even been in training camp. And they brought in some guy in off the street, and we went in to lift weights before practice. And I want to say he had, it was over 500 pounds, but I don't think it was 585. And he literally hit that for like a 6 easy reps. And we were like, Jesus. That's probably a 600-pound bench press, pretty close. And the dude was like all like chest, delts, quads. Looked like Mr. Olympia. And we went out on the field, and he was playing defensive line, and we were just doing some real easy walk-through stuff. And he's coming 100 miles an hour, like we're in helmets and I think just like shells. And he's like throwing full clubs and like just being an ass. And we're like, yo, dude, this is just a walkthrough. Chill the fuck out. And the guy's like, oh, I'm trying to make a job. And we're like, all right, motherfucker. So then you take a whole bunch of dudes that are real salty. Then we started coming off the ball. And when he was lifting his head, we just started fucking drilling him to the point where mid-practice, the little GM or manager assistant guy comes and tapped the guy on the shoulder. They cut him mid-practice because he was getting rolled up that bad. And they're like, you're going to get hurt out here. We got to send, thanks for coming out. Get the fuck out. And I just remember we saw this dude. He looked like Tarzan, played like Jane. And it was just kind of an interesting piece where, and then I saw other guys that could barely bench 225, 250, and yet went out there and slammed people. And so I didn't, there always became this kind of splinter in my mind of how do you take what you do in the weight room and translate it onto the field? And if I develop something in the weight room or I add something that, that I didn't do before, how can I make sure to always port this over into what I can do on the field?
Do you think part of that had to come down to is that his body type was probably like more the Kool-Aid man and there wasn't anything in leg wise for this individual?
No, he just, this is pure, in another life, I used to work at a circus guessing people's weights. If somebody walks up to me, just because we had to do it so often, that guy's listed 300 pounds in the program, we'd walk out and be like, that dude's like 400 pounds. So we got really good at judging height and weights. And for the athletes that I saw that had huge chests, huge quads, I was like, that guy's all right. If a dude turned and he had like a huge ass on him, huge hamstrings, and he was a little bow-legged or knock-kneed and he looked a little awkward, I always knew that guy was going to be more of a player. If the guy looked too good or if it was just too much quad and chest, I was like, those aren't, those are the show muscles, not the go muscles. So it just kind of came down to some of the body types. And normally the best defensive linemen I faced always had these really awkward, weird body types. Like just things where you're like, man, something ain't right. This dude's going to do something weird. Whereas if the guy looked like just like a, like a cartoon character, where it was like, they usually were kind of stiff. They usually kind of played high and they weren't real good about bending.
Interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, again, you probably look across the line at someone and be like, yep, I'm going to run this guy over versus, some of the other individuals where you actually were like, all right, this will be a battle all day.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, I remember the first time I played against Ted Washington and they had him listed at 360 in the program and he was probably about 420. And I remember I came off the line and I hit him and I got into him and I thought I was going to move him. And then I realized when he leaned on me that he was going to shatter my back and I just went down and cut him. And he was like, I heard your back creak. I'm like, no, you did. I mean, I felt L4, L5 compress when you leaned on me. So, you always went against, there were just some really gifted freaks and the guys that just looked real awkward. Like Willie Rofe was a great example who played left tackle for us at the, he's on the all-decade team. Willie was like pigeon-toed, knock-kneed, and he kind of walked almost like a crab walking sideways to the point where you're like, there is no way this dude plays football. And he would get in his stance and he would move faster than I've ever seen anybody move. Some of the DBs were talking shit to him one time and they lined up to run a 60 meters. And I've never seen a dude at 320 pounds move that fast.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because we were talking about combine things before. One of the things that people have started kind of tracking progress from college football, but also potentially with NFL players is momentum. So tracking momentum rather than just a time for velocity or anything like that, because again, you get some of those, whether it's defensive ends or something like that are moving large masses really, really quickly. It's difficult to stop.
Sure.
Now, again, individuals, when they're, in down in their stance and everything, they're obviously starting from zero versus some of those individuals who are kind of floating around the outside, before they're going to come in and drill the quarterback or something like that. They have a little bit more of that momentum on the side. So if they can, not to say that they're getting running a start or anything, but they're not starting from zero necessarily.
Yeah. I mean, just the, there's like a springy nature in individuals. Let's see how I can give it, almost like a set bag of concrete. I don't know if you've ever poured any concrete, but we left some concrete out and it got wet, ended up drying, and it was like hard as a rock opposed from like a bag of rice. Like you pick up a bag of rice and it's still heavy and dense, but it kind of moves. So for football players, you want dudes that are like heavy, that are like flexible, like almost like a bag of rice, not like stiff like a bag of like dried concrete. And I think a lot of the guys that are stiff like a bag of concrete, when you hit them, they absorb a lot of force and it's easy to push off them. They don't have to move. But the guys that are heavy like rice, almost like a bag of rice, they're able to move around and not as easy to take places. So it just really came down to almost like a strange kind of elastic flexibility that you could feel within guys. And it didn't have anything to do with body fat or muscle or anything. I think it's something within the structure. And I never figured out exactly, like I couldn't say, oh, they had this. But as soon as I hit a guy and I could like put my hands on him, I knew of whether or not he was going to be like hard like a board or more like rice. And that was the analogy I gave to people, which I know sounds weird, but makes total sense to me. as I would punch a guy, if he was stiff as a board, when I would hit him, he would absorb more force and I could knock him off his feet or do other things. But that other guy that was more like Rice, he would hit and could continue to keep moving.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, one last question here. Are you a Green Bay Packers fan up in Wisconsin?
I follow them, yes. Football is generally not my first sport that I'm going to seek out and watch, but you're obviously always aware of things going on. So if you're
What
going
is
to
your
ask
first sport?
About baseball, I'm a baseball fan.
Okay. Well, then I was going to talk Aaron Rodgers quickly.
I had a feeling that's where you were going with it. So,
Dude, I mean, he's going to the Big Apple. He gets a chance to be Broadway Joe all over again. I hope he shows up in a fur coat.
I hope so too. I wish he took 12, but he's taken his Cal Bears number 8.
Good for him.
Well, what's the word on the street about this Jordan Love character?
your guess is as good as mine. I mean, until he gets out there and has to prove himself and everything, we'll see what happens. But it could be a diamond in the rough. That's what everyone here is hoping. Obviously, the draft picks and everything that we're getting from this trade, everyone's kind of hot. We're going to be able to get a few more people, but a lot of people also are pretty upset with how the Packers have drafted in the past. So despite getting these better picks, we may not get anything from it. So I guess we'll see. But I know several of the performance staff at the New York Jets, and I said, have fun with Aaron. I know a lot of people here also that some people are upset that they're losing a generational quarterback and everything, but there's other people that don't let the door hit you on the way out.
Yeah. Well, it didn't go well for Favre when he went to the Jets.
Favre. No, it didn't. Well, I think that it was his own personal undoing.
Yeah, he shouldn't send dick pics. It's a bad deal. I did hear Richard Sherman make a funny comment that nobody in the NFC East is nervous about Jordan Love. There isn't a single person right now, any defensive coordinator.
NFC North.
Sorry, NFC North. There's not a single person in the NFC North that's working right now on a defensive game plan for Jordan Love. Nobody's nervous about going in against Jordan Love, whereas, Rodgers, they were nervous about. So, but Richard Sherman also talks a lot of shit, so we'll see what happens.
I mean, the team had 30, 40 years of quarterback. Like, I know Favre in at least 94. He was on the cover of Madden 94. I remember that. I don't know when he started.
Yeah, but then there was also Mikowski, the Magic Man. Remember?
Mikowski.
Yeah, he was good.
And
that was like kind of what started Green Bay's good run.
Okay.
And then they brought in, and then Favre came in, and then obviously Aaron Rodgers. So
it's a lot of pressure.
Well,
yeah, I mean, you think about the longevity of quarterbacks in Packers history. Obviously, Bart Starr and everything too. So, a lot of history, but we'll see what happens.
You think going on Joe Rogan hurt Aaron Rodgers? I think that was why they kind of traded him, where all of a sudden he's doing darkness retreats and talking about ayahuasca. And
I think drafting Jordan Love hurt him because they did the same thing they did with Favre, with Rodgers, sat him for this dude for 3 years, but instead of giving him a tool to go win, because they were NFC Championship 2 years in a row, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, but so they were a couple pieces away, and then draft this quarterback. Round 1 versus like a dude.
Yeah.
Who knows? That's why I'm sitting on a couch and watching football versus being in the office.
Well, and by no means am I going to compare Jordan Love to Tom Brady, but Tom Brady was sitting behind Drew Bledsoe until he got his chance. So obviously that never really looked back from there. So, we'll see what happens. People I think are trying to stay as optimistic as possible. In the Midwest, that's kind of the type of people that we are anyway. And worst case scenario, we have beer, cheese, and brandy old fashions.
Yeah, and cheese curds. So
That's
we
right.
We used to go to training camp at the Chiefs to River Falls, Wisconsin, and everywhere they'd be like, you want the cheese curds? And I'm like, oh god,
Yes.
Everywhere cheese curds.
Well, Tim, you said you mentioned that you're speaking at the NSCA National Conference. When is that? Where is that? And where can people follow all of your research and cool work you're doing?
Yeah, so NSCA is in Las Vegas this year. It's going to be from July 12th to the 15th. And I believe I give my couple talks on that Friday. So they're keeping me plenty busy that day. But in terms of where they can find things, you can find me on social media. Twitter and Instagram are the same. Dr. T. Suchomel is the handle. But on my Twitter profile page, there's a link to my ResearchGate, which kind of hosts where all of our research is kind of housed and published. And obviously, if you can't find anything there, you can reach out to me directly and send me an email, and would be happy to get back to you. But yeah, we're working on a lot of good things right now, and there's never enough time to write. I'm working on a book currently right now, and so we'll hopefully be able to get that out as soon as possible.
Sweet.
Awesome. Look forward to it.
All right, man. Well, thank you for joining us for Power Athlete Radio. Bye.
Bye.
This episode of Power Athlete Radio is powered by Train Heroic, the most immersive strength training app experience on the market.
We've built our online training business by partnering with Train Heroic and helping us deliver all of our world-class training programs like Jack Street, Field Strong, and Grindstone. To learn which Power Athlete training program best suits your goals, head to powerathletehq.com/training.
And if you're a coach looking to build a business with the best tech and training, go to trainheroic.co/PowerAthleteHQ.